Today's lesson entitled The Source of Islam. We'll be talking about Islam and its sources in a few moments. Let's do a little review. In chapters 18 and 19 of Genesis, we saw a comparison of the type of faith that both Abraham and Lot, his nephew, had. And we said that Abraham's faith, although it had its ups and downs, had a certain direction, didn't it? I mean, you could see improvement as he progressed in his faith. He accomplished certain things in the name of God through his faith. You know, I keep coming back to the defeat of the northern kings. He had 300 men and these were 5 chiefs, 5 kings that he was chasing and their armies, and they defeated these. The Bible doesn't give us a lot of description about the battle, but it must have been a fierce battle. And so through faith in God, he was able to defeat these northern kings who had kidnapped his nephew and the goods and the people and so on and so forth. He won a great victory. And then you see him as his faith moves him to glorify God with his work, to save others through his prayer. Last time we examined his intercessory prayer. I'm having trouble with that word today. His intercession on behalf of Lot in his prayer. These are all maturing qualities that we see in Abraham as he progresses in his faith. And of course, the result of Abraham's faith was that God answered his prayers and blessed his life and considered him righteous, right? He was saved, he was considered righteous because of his faith in God. Now, Lot's faith was different. His faith was real, just as real, but he compromised with the world. You know, when he first wanted to live in the valley where it was, the farmland was there and there was a lot of grazing, a lot of grass for his animals, so on and so forth. He lived in the valley, and then pretty soon he lived in the city. And then later on we see he's not just living in the city, but he's one of the leaders of the city. You know, he's sitting at the gate. And so there was a compromise there, and we could read between the lines, right, that his wife was not very strong in her faith to the extent that she was turned into a pillar of salt when she looked back longingly at what they were leaving behind. We also see that he was not even able to convince his own children, all of them anyways, to leave and to save themselves. And so his compromise with the world weakened his ability to witness, his ability and effectiveness to teach his children. We see that he makes no great progress spiritually. We don't read of anything he accomplished for the Lord. And in the end, he loses everything, right? His home, part of his family, everything. He's in a cave, living with his 2 daughters. And then they become pregnant by him to at least keep the family line going. So these chapters demonstrated that our lifelong relationship of faith with God includes not only Him forgiving us and being patient with our failures, it also includes faith and service and trust and progress as we move forward, right? As we move forward in our faith and in our service, in our ability to understand spiritual things, in our ability to overcome temptation. All right, so next couple of chapters, we continue the story of Abraham's walk with God, and it begins with failure. This is in chapter 20. So after the Lord and the angels visited Abraham to tell him that Sarah would conceive, and then later they left to go destroy Sodom, Abraham leaves for a trip to the capital city of the land of the Philistines, which is near the Egyptian border. Why he does this? He doesn't get any instructions from God to do this, as far as we know. Maybe the destruction of the cities near him caused some economic hardships in the area. and he needed to open up new trade and other business dealings there. Eventually he ends up living in this area because Abraham basically is a nomad, right? He's a tent dweller. And so it's not the end of the world for him to kind of pack up his tents and move where the harvest, where there's food, where there's adequate grazing land for his animals and so on and so forth. So he moves to this area. He was a chief, right? A chieftain, and had to support a very large household. And so this may have been the reason and the nature of this trip. Anyways, in verses 1 and 2, we read that he and Sarah used the exact same lie that they told in Egypt way back when, for the same purpose. He is afraid because of her beauty that she will be taken away from him. Now think about this for a second. She was 90 years old at the time. And in order to conceive, God may have rejuvenated her, that she might have been in danger. God gave Abraham and Sarah the ability to conceive a child. Well, to conceive a child requires to have sexual relations. To have sexual relations that requires desire, energy, and so on and so forth. So nothing says that God did not rejuvenate them to be able to have this child. And as I mentioned in my last lesson, Abraham was able to have more children with another wife after Sarah died. Anyways, the story is they used the same deceit in order to protect themselves. So we see that King Abimelech, which actually Abimelech like a title like Pharaoh, this king took Sarah into his harem in order to be his wife. Now, it could have been because there was sexual desire. Could also have been the desire to form an alliance with a powerful chieftain like Abraham. I mean, they did this in those times. You would take someone's sister or daughter or some relative in order to create family alliances, peace alliances, trade alliances, so on and so forth. So that could have been the reason as well. In the ensuing verses, we see that God deals with Abimelech. And again, I'm not going to read all the passages here. We have some other passages that we want to read, but I'll just kind of tell you the story. First of all, God inflicts a serious disease on Abimelech's household and possibly his entire nation, where they couldn't produce children. And then he prevents Abimelech himself from having sex with Sarah and warns him that if he does, he'll die. And then he tells him who Abraham is and tells him that if he releases Sarah, Abraham, who is a prophet, will pray for him, and that prayer will restore the health to his household and his nation. Now, we also see what Abimelech says to Abraham. First of all, he rebukes Abraham for deceiving him and jeopardizing the safety of the nation. We don't blame him there, right? He was a more righteous man than Abraham was at that point. He also rebukes Sarah and tells her that the covering that she needs is her husband, and that will be enough to protect her from the desire of other men. She doesn't have to lie. He was a great chief. He had men and power and so on and so forth, prestige. He was an honorable man. That she was his wife would have been enough to protect her from him. And I think maybe Abimelech was saying, what kind of man do you think I am to take another man's wife? Again, we see in this scene here, the king was more righteous in his attitude here than was Abraham. And then finally, like the Pharaoh, he gives Abraham money and livestock and the freedom to live anywhere in his land. Abraham accepts all of this in order certainly not to offend the king any further. So Abraham, for his part, explains his conduct to the king, and then he accepts the rebuke because of the lie and also accepts the gifts offered him. So this is the last chapter containing information on Abraham before the birth of Isaac, which begins a new period in the life of Abraham. Last chapter. So now let's talk about the child of promise. Let's go to chapter 21. We will read in this particular chapter in a few moments. Let me just set this up for you. Chapter 21 begins by describing the time of the birth of Isaac. The word of God stresses that he was born according to God's promise. God had made this promise to Abraham that he himself would have a son, even though his wife was barren, number one. And then not only was she barren, she was way past childbearing age as he was. But God made a promise and God fulfilled his promise. The fact that Abraham, as I said, was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 did not limit the promise. When God promises, he also enables. That's an important thing. Sarah was able to nurse her son, for example. Abraham was able to conceive with her, and as I mentioned, he had 6 other sons with his other wife, Keturah, after Sarah died. So God just didn't give him his virility, his youthful virility, just for one occasion in order to conceive Isaac. Apparently he stayed that way, healthy, virile, able to produce children long after Sarah died. The point here, of course, is that man's weakness cannot stop the fulfillment of God's promise. As was the custom of the time, when Isaac was weaned, Abraham made a feast for his household and the guests. So we're going to look at that part by reading now, picking up the reading in chapter 21, beginning in verse 9. It says, "Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Therefore she said to Abraham, 'Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac.' The matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. But God said to Abraham, 'Do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants will be named. And the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant.' So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba." Now, I want you to note that the old jealousy springs up, and once again Hagar is sent away with her child. God promises to care for the woman and the child, but the promise of the seed was to come through Isaac. This is the key passage that is debated among Christian scholars and Muslim scholars. Muslim scholars say, well, the Bible has been corrupted and that's not really what it says, and so the Quran is the correction of the Bible. But if you accept that the Bible is not in error, that it has not been corrupted, what we have is the Old Testament that we have today, that we're reading today, is in fact the Old Testament that they were reading 3,000 years ago, 2,500, 500 years before Christ, 400 years before Christ, they were reading the same Old Testament that we're reading. The Jesus was referring to the body of literature, the body of writing, shall we say, not literature, but writing, the body of writing, we call it the Old Testament. He would refer to it as the Word of God, the Scriptures. Well, he was referring to the very same Scriptures that we read when we read the Old Testament. Muslims say, no, something originally was written, but it has been corrupted, and the Quran is the correction of that. So just pointing to that passage and saying, okay, we're right, doesn't end the argument with a Muslim, because they don't accept the text that we are using anyways. But according to Genesis, it's very clear here that the promise, the seed of promise, is going to come through Isaac. And later on, as we continue on through the Bible, God continually refers to the seed of promise, when to Jacob and Esau. We know that it's going to come through Jacob and not Esau. So there's always a choice between which individual the seed of promise will be coming through. Note also that this is the first time, but not the last time, that Abraham has to give up a child that he loves. He loves his child, right? He loves his child. The first child born to him through Hagar, that's his son. right? That's his son. But he has to send him away, and we will know in the future that he will also have to sacrifice Isaac. So let's keep reading verse 15. It says, when the water in the skin was used up, she left the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him about a bow shot away, for she said, do not let me see the boy die. And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. God was with the lad, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So she is put into the wilderness with only a little bit of food and water, perhaps so that she would learn quickly to trust in God. Soon they are lost, and Hagar cries out to God for help, and God provides a well and safety. In one verse, the Bible summarizes how Ishmael became a hunter and how he married an Egyptian woman selected by, remember, Hagar also was an Egyptian woman. She had been taken from Egypt. She was Sarah's maid, so it's normal that she would go find a wife from her country, Egypt. In Genesis 25, we find out that Ishmael had 12 sons and became a great nation, just as God had promised. Now there's some interesting points about this particular section. First of all, the Muslim religion traces its cultural source to Hagar and Ishmael, just like the Jewish one traces back to Isaac and Abraham. Some people ask, well, I hear the word Muslim, M-U-S-L-I-M, L-I-M, and Muslim, and what's the difference here? And the word Muslim is the anglicized version of the word Muslim, which refers to a true believer. A Muslim is a true believer, a follower of the religion of Islam, and the term Islam means surrender. Okay? So know that these are the individuals that the Muslim religion finds its source in. Also, the rivalry described in this ancient text continues today, doesn't it? We see that all the time, as the Muslim world and the Jewish nation are continually at odds and at war with one another, and Muslims are at war with one another as various religious sects within Islam, fighting each other to the death, right, for control. Most of that war is about determining who is the legitimate heir of the authority of Muhammad. Okay, after he died, there began to be a dispute as to who would take on his mantle of authority over the Muslim world. And that war between the Shiites and the Sunnis and so on and so forth, that continues to this day. Also, the Muslim religion has ceremonies done today that date back to this very event here, where she's in the desert and she's crying and she goes back and forth. So the religion is set forth in three kind of categories. There are the articles of faith, which are the doctrinal creeds in the Quran, okay, in the confession. The right type of conduct, moral conduct, how you should dress, how you should act, and also religious duty, their worship, their style of worship, and what they do for prayer and so on and so forth, the fact that they pray facing east 5 times a day, that they give alms, that they fast during Ramadan and so on and so forth. This constitutes their worship. So under the section of religious duty of a Muslim is what's called the pilgrimage. And so the pilgrimage is that once in a lifetime, a Muslim or his representative, you can send a representative for your family, a Muslim must go to the holy shrine at Mecca for religious observances, for a pilgrimage going to Mecca. The shrine at Mecca, which is located in Saudi Arabia today, is considered holy for 2 reasons. First of all, It is the place where the Kaaba is kept. The Kaaba is a large square building covered by a black silk cloth. It's about 4 stories high. And inside of it is a meteorite, actually, a piece of rock, a meteorite, that fell in the region in the Middle Ages and was considered a sacred sign from Allah, which is the Muslim name for God. And so this black stone is kissed or touched by the pilgrims as they proceed around the building in circular fashion. And you may have seen pictures of this, where you have thousands of Muslims moving like waves around this Kaaba. It is also said to be near the place where Hagar was lost in the desert with Ishmael, who is the father of the Arab people. So part of the pilgrimage sees them kind of running between 2 hills and shaking their shoulders 7 times in imitation of Hagar, frantic at being lost in the desert. So this, along with prayers and teaching and fasting and almsgiving, make up their religious pilgrimage to Mecca. Another interesting thing about this story is that it reveals to us another type. Remember what I said about types? A type is a person or a place or a thing or a situation that prepares us for a person or place or a thing or a situation that God wants to reveal to us in complete truth. So I gave you many different types. Melchizedek was the type of priesthood for the priesthood that Christ would have. The ark, if you wish, was a type for the church. Remember I gave you those examples. The ark only had one, everyone who was in the ark was saved. Well, everyone who's in the church is saved. There was only one door to enter into the ark. Well, there's only one door to enter into the church, and that's Jesus Christ, so on and so forth. So I said that in the Bible there are types. Well, this section here presents us with another type. Hagar and her actions don't signify anything for us as Christians, but her relationship with Sarah is a type for another more important and ongoing relationship, and that is the conflicting relationship between the principle of law and the principle of grace and the results of each. Each woman represents one of these ideas. Hagar representing the principle of law and Sarah representing the principle of grace. And you can keep your finger there in Genesis 21, but we need to go over to Galatians chapter 4 in order to read about this idea of type for Hagar and for Sarah. So we're going to go over there, Galatians chapter 4 verse 21, and we're going to read this passage. It says, "Tell me, you who want to be under law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the bondwoman," and that bondwoman would be Hagar, "and one by the free woman," and that woman would be Sarah, of course. "But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman through the promise. This is allegorically speaking, for these women are 2 covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, barren woman who does not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For more numerous are the children of the desolate than the one who has a husband. And you, brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. But as at that time, he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. So it is now also. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of a bondwoman, but of the free woman." And so let's kind of break this down now and see what Paul is saying concerning Hagar and Sarah and how they are types. First of all, he talks about Hagar. And Hagar, he says, is a type for the law, and all of her descendants are those who follow the law, right? The Jews and the Muslims, and all who try to be saved by the principle of the law. Not just the 10 Commandments, but by the idea of perfectionism, by the idea of obeying rules, by the idea of obeying a procedure, a worship style, a sacrifice style. All of these people are all descendants of Hagar, he says, all right? Her descendants are born of the flesh in that they are great and numerous, but not the ones through whom the promise would come. They're born naturally, right? Hagar was Abraham and Sarah's way of trying to make the promise happen in a natural, fleshly way, okay? When God wanted it to happen in a supernatural way, when Sarah was beyond childbearing, when Abraham was beyond childbearing. You see what I'm saying? And she was not only beyond childbearing, but she had been barren her whole life. She couldn't even have children, even when she was a young woman. So Isaac is a product of a supernatural, a miraculous, a gracious, a gift, if you wish, to Abraham and Sarah. So going back to Hagar, he says that her people try to justify themselves with the law. They're the children of the law. And I want to tell you, if you study the Muslim religion, you will see how legalistic it is. I mean, Paul refers to Jews who try to justify themselves by the law. Well, Muslims do exactly the same thing. You have to do the pilgrimage, you have to do this, you have to pray every day. There are things that you must do, things that you must do, and if you don't do those things, you cannot live, you cannot be saved if you wish. Their natural earthly home, Paul says, is Jerusalem, not only for the Muslims, but also for the Jews. Even today, the control of the spot where the temple was, I mean, now there's a mosque over this, the Dome of the Rock, it's over the spot where the original Jewish temple was. And what's going on? Every day you read in the paper the war that's going on between, do you realize how small a country Israel is? How small the Gaza Strip is? And the West Bank, these are tiny little things. And what are they fighting over? They're fighting over who has a right to claim the city of Jerusalem, just as Paul said here 2,000 years ago, all right? Their earthly home, Jerusalem. They began by persecuting the children of the promise, Ishmael persecuting Isaac, and they continued to do so throughout history. Take a look at what's happening to Christians in Iraq these days, Christians in Syria, Christians in these Middle Eastern countries as they're being attacked and persecuted and killed by Muslim extremists. And so they began as slaves, the children of a slave woman, and they're still slaves of sin today. They're not slaves of people, but they're still slaves of sin and ignorance of the gospel today in the same way. So that's how Paul is describing them, and isn't it uncanny how that description continues to fit quite perfectly, if you wish, quite accurately, even to this day. Then he talks about Sarah, and Sarah represents grace, and her descendants are those who rely on faith in Christ to save them. No pilgrimage, no rules, no a certain thing they have to worship, certain thing they have to eat, and so on and so forth. Her descendants began as a gracious promise that is fulfilled by God's power, not man's nature. See the difference? Ishmael was born because of the normal sexual activity of Abraham and a woman who was able to have children. Okay? Nothing spectacular about that. Isaac was born in a supernatural condition under the grace of God. Her descendants, Sarah's descendants, exist because God wanted His promise to be carried by her generation. He said the promise is going to come through Isaac, and I'm going to do whatever that I have to do to make the promise come through Isaac. Her people are justified because they believe in God, not because they obey perfectly God's laws. You know, that's the core of Christian faith, right? Justification by faith, not justification by law. The complete opposite of Islam. Their temple, the descendants of Sarah, their temple is their bodies. And God dwells within them, not in a building. I don't have to go to Saudi Arabia to a ceremony to get in touch with God. The Spirit of God dwells in me already and came to dwell in me on the day of my baptism, Acts chapter 2, verse 38. They've also been persecuted for being God's children. Well, you know, we know the history of Christianity, there's been persecution. And also they began as free. They continue to live as totally free of condemnation and darkness because they're the children of light. So Hagar and Sarah's relationship and what happened to them in their lives and their descendants, these are a type, again, so important this idea, a type that demonstrates the difference between the results of those who live under the law and the results of those who live under grace. So we're going to continue in this passage. Verses 22 to 34, I'm not going to read that. But this section recounts an agreement made between Abimelech the king that originally took his wife and Abraham. Remember that? We talked about that in a previous lesson. The king wants a kind of a non-aggression treaty with Abraham, and Abraham agrees with the condition that he have the right to a disputed well site. And once this matter is settled, Abraham gives the king 7 ewe lambs, signifying the completeness of their agreement and the ownership of the well. Abraham then names the place Beersheba, which means well of the oath or well of the 7. And he returns home in the land of the Philistines, and he will live here one day, but only when Isaac is grown up and Sarah is gone. So a couple of more lessons that we can draw from our section today, the section that we covered. Lesson number 1 is we're never too old to sin, are we? You know, I had a professor in college, Dr. Baird, who at the time when I was in college was probably in his late 70s. And he once told the class that the type of sin as you get older changes, but it's always a problem for human beings. So the sins of a man who is 20 and the sins of a man who is 75, not exactly the same sins, but sin nevertheless, and sinfulness that needs to be dealt with. Well, Abraham was 100 years old, but his habit of lying about his wife to protect himself, you know, this was well ingrained, and it caused him problems even at this late date in his life. The key, of course, is to deal with sinfulness right away and not think that we're going to grow too old to be subject to temptation or to be subject to sin, or that simple aging leads to holiness. You know, denying sinfulness, it requires an effort no matter how old you are. You know, just because you're old doesn't mean you automatically are not subject to temptation. So you're never too young to start, and you're never too old to stop sinning. Number 2 lesson, mountaintops always lead to valleys. Mountaintops lead to valleys. You know, people, especially young people, think that life starts low and it just gets better and better and better and better all the time. We just evolve, better. And of course, that's the evolutionary thinking that is ripe in our society today. But the truth is that we start perfect and then we fall, and our pattern is up and down after that. This is especially true in Christian life. Mountaintop experiences are usually followed by valleys of darkness. I mean, look at it. Look at what we've just read, in the last couple of chapters. Abraham had been visited by the Lord and angels in person. Then he saved his nephew a second time through his prayer. He had been rejuvenated to the point where he had a sex life again, was active and productive. He was on top of the world, and then he lied about his wife, an old lie, and his life came crashing down, right? So this pattern happens in the church all the time. When things are going really great, there's momentum and growth and great enthusiasm, you can be sure, when that happens, you can be sure that Satan is working overtime to divide the brethren or bring sin into the camp to make things come crashing down. I'm always afraid when the church is going really well, things are moving along, we're growing, people are getting along, and so on and so forth. I'm always very cautious then for something to happen to start creating division and anger among the brethren. So when you're at the peak, my advice is slow down and be cautious, because it's easier to fall when you're on the mountaintop than when you're in the valley. Another lesson that I have found from this particular section is that His time, meaning God's time, is not always your time. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times His timing is different than your timing. God accomplished everything for Abraham in exactly the time that He said that He would. We need to understand that since God is in charge of everything, even how long or how much Satan can operate, He's also in charge of time. It's not only His time for religious things or prayers, everything runs on His time. Not just church service, 9:30, 10:30, Wednesday, 7, not just church service runs on His time, everything runs on His timetable. The rain, the good, the evil, the beginning, the end, everything's according to the Lord's timetable. Our job is to cultivate an appreciation for His timetable and develop patience. Patience. God always knows how long things will take and how long we have. We get impatient. And many good things about other religions, I guess, but there is one good thing about Buddhism. Buddhism feels that the problem with man is that he wants things, he's restless. And much of the religion, much of the practice in Buddhism is to dissipate this restlessness within man and this wanting within man. Well, that's not a bad idea. Within Christianity, we search for the peace that surpasses understanding, same idea. No more restlessness, no more wanting, no more craving. It's okay to want something, it's to crave it, okay? And I say all of this to say the following. Usually, the reason for our restlessness is that we feel that something should happen by a certain time, or we don't have enough time to do something, or we don't have enough time left, or this thing happened too soon or too late. It's always about time. The time about things usually is the thing that creates the pressure, that cranks up the stress, right? If we just understood that God knows the time for everything, everything is under His control. If we just learn to submit to His timetable, we would have a much less stressful life, because He never forgets the time, and He never is late, and He never wastes time, not His time or our time. And He's always aware of the time that we have left. So that's a very comforting thought. So if we'll become much more aware of how God is in charge of time, we will then become much less stressed if we realize that the world operates on God's timetable and not ours. Certainly we as Christians, as believers, should embrace that idea much more than the world embraces that idea. In the world, they're trying to relegate the time. We in the Christian world are trying to submit to God's timetable. Okay, well, we're going to stop there for this week. A little information about Sarah and Hagar as types for the grace of God on one side, Sarah, and the process or the system of law if you wish, on the other. All right, we're going to continue next time. I'm glad that you were here, glad that those who are watching on video have selected the Genesis course to take. Hope that it is edifying for you and encouraging as well. All right, we'll see you next time.